Good morning, everybody who is here in person and also those who are joining online. Thank you for joining our session on the sustainable management of the water, energy, food, land, ecosystems nexus. Tahir and I would like to start by thanking the conference organizers with putting together such a great event. We'd also like to thank the Austrian Academy of Sciences for using their wonderful facilities. And thanks also to the staff in helping to set up and make sure all of these logistics are running smoothly, so thank you very much. We're delighted to have all of you with us today to talk about the Water, Energy, Land Plus Nexus, and even more delighted to have the panelists with us that could join us today. We know that much of the world's population lives without reliable access to safe water, energy, and healthy food. The world continues to change, and policymakers need to take into account the interconnectedness of water, energy, and land to meet each person's basic human rights and needs to this safe and healthy food, water, and energy. Today, we've convened a panel of experts to speak about the Nexus challenges and how science can help support policymakers in developing sustainable and synergistic policies and investments that can adapt to an interconnected and uncertain future. So, take it away, Tahir.
Okay, thank you for coming to this session. So today we have managed to invite a number of outstanding speakers. Together they cover a range of expertise from biophysical modeling and economic analysis to governance and stakeholder engagement and policy advice. So today we have with us Claudia Ringler, Deputy Director of the Environment and Protection Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Amin Shourbaghi, Professor at Department of Civil and Geological Environmental Engineering and Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, Canada. Katia Karousakis, Program Lead of Biodiversity at OECD. Barbara Villarts, Research Scholar at the Biodiversity and Natural Resources Program at IIASA, and Raymond Meyer, a Senior Water Resource Management Specialist at the World Bank. So the session will be divided into two parts. The first part is the presentations, and the second part is a panel discussion. So, and we will be happy to also get questions after the presentation and also during the panel discussion. So we should now start maybe with the first presentation, which will be provided by Claudia.
So, first thanks to IIASA for inviting me to this really exciting 50-year anniversary. I think I was also there at the 40th anniversary. And in terms of how does IFPRI collaborate with IIASA, I think Amanda, who gave you one of the introductory talks, she actually used to work with us at IFPRI. So I think just a staff exchange, I think alone is a very important way of collaboration. So Amanda asked me to talk a little bit about some global connections across the Nexus. So, and also where the Nexus thinking came from. And maybe also to mention, get back to IIASA, one, I think, unique comparative advantage that IIASA has on Nexus work is it's not only that systems is in the title, because obviously we talk about systems here, but also that IIASA doesn't have a mandate, that would support one sector over another. And that is different for me. I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute, so we're a partner in the world's largest agriculture research for development research system, and obviously we have a very clear mandate on food security and nutrition. So while we do work on the Nexus, we do it with a clear mandate and responsibility for improving food security. So I was just at COP27, and a couple, I think others have been as well. And I think I just was sitting in a big room and I took a picture of this graph. And, to me, this is one of the reasons of why Nexus analysis became more of a topic of why studies have grown since the mid-2000s. And the reason is that, in the mitigation assessments and modeling, to try to get the world to either 1.5 degrees or to 2 degrees, agriculture actually plays quite a big role. And what I just circled here in red is what they call modern biomass and waste. And already 15 years ago or so, I talked to some of the energy modelers, and I said, you find you can't get to your this is 1.6 degrees, okay. You can't get to your results without bioenergy, but reality is we work in these countries all the time, and you can't just remove bioenergy, right? You actually reduce productivity, or you compete with land, water, capital, labor. You actually, reduce food security. And the answer was modern biomass, and that's still there. And I don't think much has happened, at least not in the countries I'm working in. So the other background, of course, for why much more is being done on Nexus has been this Energy Independence and Security Act of the United States in, I think, 2007, that contributed to one of the 15 joint food, fuel, and fertilizer crises. So again, when you come from a food security aspect, we look at fertilizer prices separately, just from transportation fuel or fuel for pumping groundwater for both domestic and food production reasons. So this Energy Independence and Security Act directly contributed, according to our analysis. There's many other analyses out there. We calculated that about 30% of this 2007-8 so-called food price crisis was contributed by this bioenergy mandate, that led to the conversion or the use of maize as transportation fuel. And today, about 40% of maize or corn in the United States is used for biofuels, 40% for feed, and 20% is other. And some of the other is actually eaten as food, and some of the other is also exported. So, why do we talk about water, energy, food? And importantly, I think nowadays we always try to bring in environment or ecosystem health. So it's not just WEF Nexus, it's WEF Nexus. Why do we talk about that, or why it's considered much more important today is because we have now 3 crises in just 15 years. And of course, we've had one in the 70s. We had a very big fuel crisis that also led to food price increases. But since 74, between mid-70s to 2007-8, food prices had gone down. Now, they keep going up, down, and of course, the energy food connections are a key reason, but climate change is the other reason. So that's why we're talking about in a climate crisis. And the most recent crisis, which of course is directly linked to the war on Ukraine, so to Russia's war, was not only very unusual because it's a war that started it, a war where we have Russia as a large energy exporter, and both Russia and Ukraine as a large provider of staple grains. But this one was connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the gray bars here show you that GDP growth, the gray bars are GDP growth in low and middle income countries, was negative before the crisis started. So the actual implications for poor people are a lot more extreme than we can imagine. Here we talk about, it's expensive, energy is expensive, food is expensive. In those countries where they spend 40 to 60% of their income on food and 20% of the rest on energy to cook or whatever, to heat, the crisis is so much more in the countries, as also Jim said, they have huge indebtedness, and the crisis is really very hard to imagine for us. And then, yesterday was already mentioned that, again, linked to these crises, also civil conflict, but obviously not just Ukraine. There's a lot of wars going on in the world, Yemen, etc. Other civil conflicts. So since 2014, the number of hungry people has actually gone up, and we alone have 150 million more hungry people in 2021 compared to 2019, which is COVID-19 before the war in Ukraine. Yesterday we heard some numbers on hungry people. I think it was only 100 million total, but I think it's really closer to about 900 million people, which is a bit more than 10% of the global population. And yes, there's various other crises, malnutrition, about 2 billion people, and also overweight of actually 2 billion, so every fourth person in the world. So there's a lot of food-related crises going on. So, but now moving from food to water, many studies out there. We know that water stress is growing, so this is something I worked on a couple of years ago. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that maybe about a third, of the population was affected by water stress, and we're moving to about 50% by 2050. And again, there's many ways to think about it. There's many ways to model it. Some people also say, oh, how many months in a year? But you can also, just say which river basin are more than 40% of accessible resources withdrawn by, for example, 2050. So that's the approach used here. So we know it's growing. Another feature I think we need to do more work on is that storage needs, storage availability is declining, storage needs are growing. So that also links to this growing water stress, because if you don't have some resources to draw on, if you're in a drought situation, you're in a dire situation. And we know again that low and middle income countries are mostly affected by that. A key storage source, of course, has become groundwater, because we have new technologies to extract groundwater since the late 70s, early 80s, when individual pump sets became affordable, new well drilling technologies. So now we have the challenge of groundwater depletion that's particularly strong in India, but also parts of China, and only parts of India, but substantial parts, US, Iran, and many other countries. And it will grow, because that's what people increasingly rely on. And we did try to assess the impact of eliminating groundwater depletion on the risk of hunger. And this one just shows changes in food prices globally, if we implement a groundwater conservation policy. And as globally, in terms of irrigation water volume, most of it goes to rice and wheat. And so unsurprisingly, the blue bar here is rice and the brown bar is wheat. So we would see the largest food price increases for those two crops if we were to try to be more sustainable on the groundwater side. Ag water pollution, I will not show any energy slides, but groundwater is obviously very closely linked to energy. You have to get that water up one way or another. And the deeper you go, the more effort is needed. Water pollution is another area that we started to look into, also not as much as we should. And that's another, it's another energy issue. Oh, I'm almost out of time. Okay, it's another energy issue because you somehow have to treat it. And a lot of municipal water utilities spend a lot of energy on trying to treat all this polluted water. Climate change grows, Nexus approaches. And I am also here to mention that CGR has a series of new research initiatives, and one is called Nexus Gains, and I wanted to just show you what we're trying to work on, and if anyone is interested to collaborate, please let me know. So one is foresight, one is water productivity and storage, see if there's a big storage gap. We try to energize food and water systems for poor people sustainably, and then we focus on governance. I mean, this morning, interestingly, I think a lot of the talks did focus on governance and institutions, and of course, capacity building. So this is a storage diagnostic that IMI has developed also a while ago, but it's as important as ever before. How does it change under climate change? And just some topics we are interested in: groundwater governance, inclusive business models, multi-stakeholder platforms, and capacity building. And just a few last thoughts. COP27, big focus on climate justice, but we really don't know what works for the poor. We know a few things, but it's not happening. So what do we need to do, to get there? We need more serious engagement still between NDCs, nutrition and health impacts, going back to the first slide, better understanding how water management relates to adaptation and mitigation. There is a UN Water Conference in 2023. I don't know if you are engaging. And then, of course, ecosystem, health, and the Nexus. So beyond words. It's very difficult to model it well. Again, a lot of talks this morning on that topic already. Thanks so much. Sorry for being a bit too slow.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. Extraordinary presentation. Any questions from the audience to Claudia? Okay, then maybe we leave the question to the panel discussion. So let's then move to the next presentation by Amin, Professor Amin Shourbaghi. He will tell us about advances in Nexus modeling.
All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to start by thanking Amanda and Tahir for giving me the opportunity to be with you here today. So as you can see from the title, that I would like to talk about some of the boundary challenges of resource nexus. I think throughout history, we know that man moved around basically searching for water, for fertile land, to get food and feed for humans and for the animal, looking for proper sources of energy, which can be just as simple as fire. But after that, when we got some technology, we managed to move resources to people rather than people going after resources. So we transport water, natural gas. We do that over land, under the ocean. With advancement in technology, we saved people from really moving around searching for these resources. However, even over these thousands of years, I think the lesson that we get, the message is still valid today, which is either we transport resources to people or people will come to the resources. So there is no other alternative. So with that, the idea of that global trade network was established so that we are trading food, we are trading energy, we are trading all other materials, and that led to the establishment of a global trade network that would look as busy as this, and that changed our concept from self-sufficiency, growing food, for example, in our own backyard, to the concept of food security or resource security. If you have the money in your pocket that would allow you to buy the food that you need at the time you need, then you are food secure, right? But then pandemics came, wars, natural extremes like droughts and different events came to question this concept of if you just have the money, you can get what you need at the time you need. And I see nowadays countries around the globe started to go back to the concept of self-sufficiency. We need to have at least certain amount of things in our own backyards. So that brings to us the idea that when we talk about nexus, water, energy, food, and by the way, some people call it virtual water because it's water in the form of food, water in the form of energy, and when you trade that, you trade in what is called virtual water, that these resources are global. What happens in one corner of the world will definitely affect all other places. Just to get you some numbers from the literature, there are virtual land imports by certain countries. For example, if you know 48% of New Zealand land grows crops just to export to China. 15% of Brazil's land just go to China. 11% of Canada's land grow crops for for China. 30% of Canada's irrigation water and 16% of nitrogen fertilizer is to grow things that will be exported to China. So people also externalize their environmental burden, their things, by owning virtually even water and land in other countries. And we also have seen that a single big exporter can generate a worldwide shock. So if there is an extreme drought in Canada or Russia or Australia, so many countries around the globe suffer from food crisis because of drought that's happening somewhere else. This is due to the global trade network. And we have learned that poor countries actually even suffer more. Definitely, they are more vulnerable at the time of shocks or global crises. So when we talk about WEF or water, energy, food nexus problems, they are never local problems. No matter where they happen, these are global problems. So if we ask the question, how can we plan? How can we manage this? Let's take the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, one of the most arid or the hyper-arid region of the world. We can see that, like any other region, their water use is that they use water for high-value purposes, like manufacturing, mining. Some is like must-use, like municipal water use. But their biggest use of water, almost 80% in this region, is for food production. It means to them a lot. It means self-sufficiency. It means economic stability, less vulnerability. But the more you need to produce food, the more you use your water resources. And the question they always have is that, do we want to deplete every drop of water that we have, or do we afford to import virtual water, to import food from other places? So that brings water, food, and of course, in many instances, energy as well, with trade in a nexus. And we cannot make decisions on these resources management, sustainable management, without looking at this concept of virtual water and the economic considerations of that. And we cannot consider that without having tools that allow us to assess both sides, production and consumption, supply and demand together. We cannot develop models, for example, just for water supply. So these both sides are important. And I'm bringing here the example of Egypt just as an example. A country in North Africa that is quite arid. And if you look at this nightlight map of Egypt, you see that people are just living around this narrow strip around the Nile, which is just 7% of the land. People live and grow crops on the 7% of the land. 97% of renewable fresh water is coming from somewhere else, from outside the country. And where is that somewhere else? That is the Nile Basin, which is really in the heart of a very tough diplomacy and a lot of negotiations, water conflicts, and so on. So the result of this is that virtual water is being imported into Egypt from all corners around the world in the form of food and crops. So we just developed simply a tool, I'm not talking about any details here, that can look into the food consumption side, the food production, agricultural production, and the water resources system that has to supply industry, municipal, and all uses, and the remaining water goes to agriculture. So when we look at that and look at a historical period as well as projected up to year 2050, and this is just the food gap in million tons, no matter what national scenarios there are in the country, optimistic or pessimistic scenarios, we can see that the food gap is just growing over years up to year 2050. And this is mainly due to the result that the water gap is growing in the country exponentially. So we tried to get some input from global models like impact, for example, of IFPRI, to try to see, because global models can give us an idea about projections of the food prices, different crop prices, and so on, under different scenarios of SSPs, climate change, and so on. So we can have projections of the prices, let's say, of different crops. Why is this important? Because that brings to us the question of what is the policy variable for a country like Egypt that they can play with to manage the situation better. It's a cropping pattern. What do they grow locally? Should they focus on wheat on most of the land, or fodder, or rice, or maize? Every scenario here you change. If you keep changing, playing with the crop composition, it means a lot. The amount of water they need locally is very different. The amount of food they need to import is very different, and so on. So what we are trying to look at here, we think that this is a multi-objective problem, really. Why is that? Because a country like Egypt would like to minimize the water use in agriculture. They would like to maximize the gross margin in agriculture for farmers' benefit. They would like to minimize the food they import from outside, and they would like to minimize the cost of the import. So you can import more of food that is less expensive, for example. So when we look at this and we use our tool to keep generating different cropping pattern composition in the country, we can get hundreds of possible combinations of crop compositions. Each dot here represents a different cropping pattern, different crop composition. So what do we see here? If you want to improve or get the maximum of the gross margin, you want to be at that side. If you want to reduce your agricultural water use locally, you want to be at the top here. So ideally, you want to be at this corner, at this black dot here, for the best outcome. But if you want to consider to minimize the cost of your food import, you want these blue dots, the dark blue dots. And if you want to reduce the amount of food you are importing from outside, you want the smaller dots rather than the big dots here. This is how we represented the different cropping pattern. So actually, you want to be at this corner of the slide. So you can see here the trade-off is very clear. What to do? You have to lose in something to gain in something else. And when we look at this, we see that if you consider different scenarios in the future, if you consider different climate scenarios, each scenario would push you to develop or to adopt a different cropping pattern. So those are the 4 criteria I'm talking about, those vertical lines. And ideally, the best solution is to be on top of those 4 criteria. Now, if we assume that we know what happens in the future in terms of climate change and so on, then we would choose one of these lines. One of these lines, because we assume we know the future for certain, then one line here would be the cropping pattern that we should adopt. Change the future conditions because we don't know it, that's the uncertainty. Different cropping patterns are coming as these lines. If we look at the historical cropping pattern in Egypt, it is the one in the bottom here. So obviously that there will be a need to change in the future the cropping pattern in order to gain more on these different, but this approach, we call it robust solution. You can pick a solution here that on average is doing the best in terms of 4 criteria, even no matter how you are changing the future conditions. Now, if we change that and try to look at the Nile Basin where Egypt is getting all its water, each country of the Eastern Nile Basin, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, has their own plans in terms of water, energy, and food development. Okay? So if we develop a similar system to the entire basin, we can see that there is a lot of fight now, actually, because of just one large dam is being built in Ethiopia here that's called the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That is one dam that is bringing 70 billion meter cube of storage along the Nile system in Ethiopia. Now, what's happening in the future? Ethiopia is planning 11 additional reservoirs that will add 240 billion meter cube of storage. So how the fight will be if they keep just looking at the problem as water apportionment problem. Now, this is a very busy slide, but I just want you to focus on those food gap in these 4 countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Ideally, you want to be at the bottom here because at the bottom, the food gap is less. So we can see that the food gap can be at the minimum level under green and blue scenarios. What are these green and blue scenarios? A lot of expansion in rain-fed agriculture in the upper basin, closing the crop yield gap, because there is a lot of yield gap in the upper basin, especially in the upper basin, and perhaps doing a serial shift, okay, that can get you a good solution perhaps to most of these, or to all 4 countries, without really focusing on the issue of apportionment of the Nile water. Now, this is my last slide here, I think. So even if you want to look at the hydropower that's being generated in the basin, the blue and green scenarios are still giving as high possible values of hydropower generated in all 4 countries. So you can see that there is a lot of good solution and compromise, but you need to look at it as water, food, and energy together rather than apportionment of water only. So the nexus is not luxury. It has to be the way of thinking. You have to think about water and virtual water together. Solution of water problems is not necessarily water-based, okay? So there are so many other things. How can we close the yield gap? You need economic investment, technology in the upper Nile basins. You need a lot of socioeconomic development to change the consumption patterns and so on. So even transboundary water conflicts are ill-characterized when they are described as conflicts over water. It has to be described as a nexus issue. So the local management has to be in light of global trade regionalization. We should not talk about water security or food security or energy security. We should be talking about integrated resource security. So interestingly, when we did some analysis on the Eastern Nile Basin, the food gap can be closed completely in this area, but for the whole basin together, not for any country individually. They cannot do that. So the lesson that we learned is simple, that we always learned since we were children, that alone I can be vulnerable, but together we are resilient. This applies to a country, to a sector, to an industry, to anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amin. Excellent presentation. Not sure if there are any questions from the audience. We can take one quick question. Otherwise, we leave them to the panel discussion. Okay, seems no question. So we leave it to the panel discussion. So our next speaker, Katya Karusakis from the OECD. Katya is joining us online. Thanks, Katya, for joining. The floor is yours now to talk about biodiversity and Nexus management.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to go ahead. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate today at this IIASA event, and also congratulations on the 50-year anniversary. It's my pleasure to speak today on the issue of biodiversity and the sustainable management of the water, energy, food, land, and ecosystem nexus. And I'd like to start first by highlighting how broad and multidimensional the term biodiversity actually is. It covers all animal and plant species, all ecosystems, so terrestrial, aquatic, and marine, as well as genetic diversity, and therefore it underpins all aspects of human life, from food and freshwater, including to our global economies. And below here, I've just highlighted, both in terms of biodiversity in water and biodiversity food, the fact that since biodiversity is such a massive component of our natural capital and provides invaluable ecosystem services, it's fundamental for a number of our general life support systems, such as water storage and flow regulation, filtering, and flood and drought protection in the context of water. And in terms of food, provides a number of ecosystem services, such as creating and maintaining healthy soils, pollination, controlling pests, and providing habitats for wildlife. So in this context, given how embedded our biodiversity and interlinked biodiversity in the economy is, it's also fundamental for achieving numerous of the SDGs. However, as many of us already know, I'm sure, it's very important to consider both the synergies and the trade-offs. And you see here how at the foundation is SDG 14 and 15, which is life underwater and on land. And digging here a little deeper into the specific interlinkages with the different SDGs, according to this report, which looks across a number of different, has brought together a number of different findings with regard to biodiversity and interlinkages. You see here those links with each of the SDGs, with blue referring to the co-benefits and red to the possible trade-offs. And also just to note that the size of the rings represent gaps in knowledge and also weaker interventions. So in this context, work at the OECD, which I'm focusing on here today, focuses on different strands of work across the Nexus issues, either directly or indirectly. And we've taken various approaches to examining these issues. Here, for example, in our work on towards sustainable land use, aligning biodiversity, climate, and food policies, we looked specifically at how governments can facilitate coherent policies for land use across three particular entry points. So we looked across the different relevant national strategies and plans in the context of biodiversity, climate, and food. We looked at what mechanisms are in place to facilitate institutional coordination and coherence, and also how the design and implementation of policy instruments can foster effective policies. And in particular, we looked at 6 countries, drawing on their insights there. We chose these 6 countries because they had relatively large greenhouse gas emissions, important areas for biodiversity, and hotspots, etc. And some of the messages we found here in terms of national strategies and plans, for example, is that land use is often considered separately in these national plans, whether they're related to national development, climate plans, biodiversity strategies and action plans, or agricultural plans. And in this case, it's really important to prepare these strategies in a consultative and coordinated manner. And it's also very important to include specific and measurable targets when developing these plans, so that you can more clearly identify whether the targets across the different plans are indeed aligned, and also to develop associated indicators so as to monitor progress and be able to see whether we are indeed on track. In terms of institutional coordination and the mechanisms that are in place there, we found both weak institutional coordination and in several cases, overly complex institutional arrangements, which contribute to policy alignments. And in this case, some of the good practice insights in order to foster better institutional coherence is to encourage stakeholder engagement and leadership from the top. And also to establish interministerial committees bringing together the different relevant ministries or other similar cross-cutting bodies, so as to ensure that, the goals and the strategies across each of these are aligned. In terms of the policy instruments across these different biodiversity, climate, and food policy elements, and also in particular, given the countries we looked at, it was especially important to ensure clearly defined and enforced land tenure, or at least in some of the countries we looked at, but a key prerequisite. And also that as in many cases, and this is true in many countries, that the negative externalities associated with land use still remain largely unpriced or underpriced, calling for the need also for better data, including to integrate spatial data to help inform decision-making, and also the need to scale up economic and other types of regulatory instruments in order to internalize these externalities, without which we will continue on business as usual scenarios and the overexploitation of biodiversity and its and its misuse. We also have other work at the OECD that has looked at the implications of, for example, the global material resources and how this will implicate on the environment. We see here, for example, based on projections to 2060, and the report looked at global, sectoral, and regional level implications for 61 materials in total. Overall, finding a projected of doubling of global primary materials use between today and 2060. And here, for example, you see across different environmental areas, the types of impacts they have, also relevant to biodiversity, as we have acidification, terrestrial ecotoxicity at the bottom, freshwater aquatic ecotoxicity as well, etc., and also climate change. Given that climate change is one of the three largest pressures on biodiversity, these are, of course, also inherently interlinked. So you see here the results for concrete, for iron, for copper, and also for other materials here. We've also done work on the land-water energy nexus, which provides projections for the biophysical and economic consequences of land, water, and energy nexus bottlenecks up until 2060. And some of the findings here highlight that while the land-water energy nexus is essentially local, there can be significant large-scale repercussions, especially in vulnerable regions, notably on forest cover, and both in terms of food and water security. In terms of some ongoing work that we've been doing, and also coming up work in the future, the OECD has been undertaking OECD environmental outlooks on fairly regular time periods. For example, in 2012 now, we released the OECD Environmental Outlook to 2050, which covered 4 thematic areas: climate, biodiversity, water, and human health, and also the interlinkages thereof. I'm not going to go into the findings here because it's a little outdated, but we had done earlier work as well. But just to highlight also, we will be embarking on a new OECD environmental outlook starting next year with a tentative release in 2025, 2026, which will also look at biodiversity, of course, as one of the environmental areas, as well as a number of others. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions or follow up in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Katja. Great presentation. Touching on a very important issue, which is biodiversity and how biodiversity could be integrated into Nexus studies. Any question from the audience on Katja's presentation? If not, then we also leave it to the panel discussion, and then we move to the next presentation, which will be by our colleague, Barbara Wielart. I think Barbara is not able to join us today because of she's in a mission, but she made a video for us to talk about co-development and stakeholder involvement in Nexus projects and some examples from IIASA Nexus ongoing and past Nexus projects. So maybe we could start the video for Barbara.
Good morning, everyone. Let me start by thanking Amanda and Tahir for inviting me to this session today, and apologies for not being able to join you in person, but due to other project commitments, I'm actually in the field implementing some of the activities related to some of the projects that I will be introducing today. So what I would like to share with you today is some of the experiences that I gained over the years working on Nexus, and particularly at IIASA, and trying to move this scientific concept from the theory to the practice, no? And through the reflection of some experiences from co-production processes that we have been applying in different parts. So one important thing that I would like to highlight is that, of course, this is not my own work, but this is a work that I have been doing with many other IIASA researchers, and I would like to acknowledge that this is these are not just my ideas, but also much of the work that has been happening with lots of colleagues around. So let me start about framing what is Nexus. Without wanting to go in deep conceptual discussions, I think the term Nexus emerged more than 10 years ago, or was formalized more than 10 years ago, and specifically looking at the interlinkages between different sectors and the need to take these interlinkages into account, to minimize the sectoral trade-offs. Slowly, other than the water, food, energy sector, we started including all other different dimensions, and slowly it started to become more of a kind of a concept that was dealing with managing and or developing an integrated approach to resource use management. And out of this started to, more strongly mainstream the message, that Nexus was really about trying to fostering greater policy coherence. And I think the fact that we have expanded from water, food, energy into many other areas which go beyond these sectors and embrace climate and embrace biodiversity, at the end of the day, is just referring to, or in my personal experience, I think that what we are talking about is basically about managing complex systems, which might be, a different way of calling things that we used to call in the past systems analysis. But no matter, this is my own perception, so no matter where this is or not the case, I think what is really Nexus about is about adopting a system thinking. And why does Nexus matter? I think because many of the challenges that we have ahead of us, even though do not have the label Nexus, they actually have a very strong Nexus component. And I think it is important when we think about climate change and biodiversity that at the core of these challenges there is a very important Nexus component. So the commonalities that all these sustainability challenges have in common is that they're extremely complex problems that involve many different sectors, actors, values, and countries. That it's also, because of their complexity, they are also associated with a very high uncertainty, and it is very difficult not to foresee what are the implications of our action, and especially in the long term. And also there is this concept or this idea of ambiguity, which is very important, because this is not just referring to the fact that, different type of people have expertise about different parts of the system, but even the way we frame the system and the way we look at the problems is very much driven by our values and our perceptions. So this is a very important element to take into account. So where does this bring us? I think this brings us into the area where we acknowledge that all these sustainability challenges cannot just be addressed by science, cannot just be addressed by policy, and can definitely not be addressed alone by society. So there is a close and strong need for cooperation, and we are always confronted with these gaps, with these persistent gaps that exist between science, policy, and society. And I think the reflection and the work that we have been doing at IIASA is trying to reflect how can we, from the scientific point of view, bridge these gaps. And these gaps, in many cases, they respond to the fact that we speak different languages, that we have sometimes, different goals, that we speak in terms of different timelines, and that we are also driven by different incentives. But this is not an excuse to say that we really need to make our best to bridge these gaps. And as scientists, I think we can do better in many different ways. I've used this cartoon because I think it's very illustrative of different things, not just our inability sometimes to communicate with non-academics, but I think more importantly, the way in which science has been framed for a long time. It is very much from the perspective of scientists framing the problem, analyzing the problem, and then communicating very complex results in ways which are not necessarily understandable by our colleagues, and which probably also not reflect the way of stakeholders actually perceive the problem. So this is where we need to move away from. And this is what I would like to share now, is some of the experiences that we gained through the application of different techniques and different processes that, in the course of the last year. So one particular project is this integrated solutions for water, energy and land, which was a flagship project at the IIASA that finalized in 2020, and that was mainly intended to develop to support the development of tools and capacities for the management of water, energy and land at global but also regional scales, and with a particular focus on transboundary basins. So let me give you a short illustration about what we have done in the Zambezi Basin. So the Zambezi Basin cuts across eight countries in the southern part of Africa, and it is a basin that is facing many development challenges. And in response to this, of course, there is many sectoral plans being put forward by the different countries. So at the time we were developing this project, the Zambezi Watercourse Commission was trying to facilitate a dialogue across the different countries and the different ministries about what could be the implications of putting forward these sectoral development plans, and what will be the cross-sectoral implications and also downstream implications, no? And importantly as well, how climate change was playing a role in this space, and how it could affect sectoral and country development plans. So we work in close collaboration with the Zambezi Watercourse Commission and with their network of stakeholders, and we were basically, ministries from the different countries and also non-state decision makers and practitioners also played and support the process. So we develop what we call a co-production approach, which is no more than a methodological approach that is able to combine and integrate different type of approaches, soft approaches for being able to capture and understand, what is the perception and the knowledge that the stakeholders have about what is the challenges in the basin, as well as the potential solutions. And then we combine this also with our own model and an analytical tool. So the process had a 3-step approach. So first is the current understanding of what are the current challenges and identifying priority areas. And this was done basically, we developed what we call a scenario tool, which basically was consist on producing these big maps about the different basin and working with the stakeholders, producing different type of cards that were representing different type of resources, infrastructure, socioeconomic activities and pressures. So basically the whole process here was putting all these different stakeholders, which never have the occasion and rarely have the occasion to work at that level, to try to have a vision or a system understanding about what is the current situation in the entire basin. We use this as a reference to try to do applying forward-looking applying scenario techniques, and we explore 2 different type of scenarios. One was looking at what if nothing changes, a business as usual, and this was quite useful and eye-opening for many decision makers, because normally, of course, they do not think in these time frames. Normally, their time frames are a bit shorter. So it actually guided or lead to a very nice and interesting discussion. No? This was used as a reference, the business as usual, and the many challenges that could be anticipated that will come up, in the medium term if nothing changes, actually lead or set the pathway to develop what we call desired vision. So basically this here, where we were working with the stakeholders, trying to say, okay, we know where you don't want to be, so let's try to map where you would like to be, and then try to, on the basis of that, to look where we are and try to develop so to say, a process, and an action planning, to put you in the vision and in that you would like to be. All this qualitative process ended up in the development of a number of narratives, and these narratives were then informing our models. So we were able to produce a number of quantitative scenarios using an integrated modeling framework and relying on many of the IIASA models. So out of this modeling exercise, we were able to share back with the stakeholders a number of quantitative scenarios, looking at the cost and benefits of different development scenarios. I mean, here, these are the results aggregated. We also had this per country. And also from an environmental and social perspective, no? And this was actually very useful to trigger the discussion about what are the implications of all these sectoral development plans. In the words of Samcom, this process was an eye-opening to really link practical knowledge to available science. So in this way, I think we pretty much succeed at the time of, bridging part of these gaps that I was discussing about. These are examples of other projects that we are currently developing, where we are also applying this Nexus thinking and co-production processes. This is actually the project that is having me now on the field developing some participatory activities, and it's about localizing the SDG agenda at subnational level in Africa and understanding all these interlinkages also and synergies and trade-offs between different SDGs. And then there is another project that we are working on also with a strong focus on developing a toolkit and a co-production framework and testing it in some regions, particularly in India. But these are all ongoing projects. So what are the take-home messages? I think Nexus, I would like to stress that from my perspective, is really about adopting a systems approach, that the moving of research Nexus to Nexus management is definitely ongoing, and decision makers are increasingly aware about the implications of just adopting sectoral approaches and not taking into account cross-sectoral considerations, also because of the inefficiencies that are arising from failing to meet different policy targets. And from the scientific point of view, I think there is a growing, the transdisciplinary approaches are gaining a lot of ground, and there is quite a lot of innovation going on in terms of approaches. But I also would like to stress that despite all this progress, I think we have to acknowledge as scientists that co-production is easier said than done, because it requires a lot of resources and facilitation and social abilities, which, for which we need to be trained as well. And also a lot of flexibility and willingness to adapt as the project move on to some sort to, reconcile with our research objectives, with the stakeholder demands. And importantly is that I think if we really want to succeed and bringing the Nexus concept into real implementation and management, I think other than innovating a lot with the development of stakeholder engagement approaches and doing very sophisticated analysis and modeling approaches, I think we need to have a very good understanding and research on what is the governance context and political economy consideration. And with this, I would like to finish and thank you all for your attention.
This was great, yeah. I don't know if there is any questions about this video. Maybe Amanda and myself, we could also reply in case of any question, or we also leave it to the panel discussion. Okay, seems there is no question. So I would like to follow up on what Barbara said. So it's time to move from Nexus research to Nexus management. And for that, we need to now hear from Raymond, from the World Bank, the practical and development perspective on Nexus thinking. Raymond, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daher, and good afternoon in the meantime to everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation, obviously, to IIASA's birthday party. I'm happy to be involved, and kudos to the previous speakers. I think there was, to many of the things which were said, it's really, I could just tick it off and say, this is also the discussions we are having in the World Bank. I think there's so much knowledge around which we try to integrate also in our discussions on development priorities with our client countries, that it's nice to see that there's basically quite a coherence also there in terms of our thinking and what is presented here also from the research side. I tried to a little bit, provide some information on the activities, how we try to approach it, and link also science with policy and to reach intersectoral cooperation also in our development work, and happy to have more detailed discussions then afterwards with a couple of practical examples. With these slides, I'd like to start also. I think it's clear to everybody that water is essential for a number of aspects, for sustaining the planet, for environmental aspects, for economic development, for social development. And I recognize that the next couple of slides will be quite negative, because actually they will be about the challenges we are facing currently, but also which are expected to come up with socio-economic development and climate change also in the future. So I thought let's start with a positive message, namely the Millennium Development Goals. And that the Millennium Development Goal on water supply has been achieved actually ahead of time. And between 1990 and 2010, access to water supply has been achieved for an additional 2 billion people. And I think that's really a very positive development, and also shows that change is possible, that really developments in the positive direction are possible. Quite a lot related to the economic development of China, but there was also a lot of progress made in the other countries. So this really shows also that it's possible to make progress in development and achieve certain objectives. However, challenges are quite significant and still significant when we talk about sustainable development. We see that 90% of the natural disasters worldwide are water-related. We see also that globally still around 80% of the wastewater is still untreated. And we see, while floods are very much in the headlines, that droughts cause an economic impact which is expected to be 4 times larger, and this is expected to increase also in the future. And 4 billion people are currently living in regions that are expected to be under severe water stress, and this situation is expected not to become better in the future with climate change. So the challenge is significant. Some info on the pressures also, as I mentioned, which are expected to increase also in the future. So by 2030, it's expected that the demand for water will exceed the supply by 40%. This could mean that by 2050, as many as around 140 million people across the developing regions will become climate migrants. So it has a huge socio-economic dimension. Water is very much in the focus when we talk about climate change adaptation, because climate change is very much translated through the water cycle and has impact on many different sectors. One example, I think, which is quite well known from my colleagues working in Central Asia, where I'd like to point out the intersectorial issue of the topic is the Aral Sea. I think everybody of you is aware of the particular situation of the Aral Sea. Starting in the 1960s, there was quite significant water abstraction for agricultural irrigation in the region, which led to a shrinking of the Aral Sea until 1997, until the end of the 1990s, down to 10% only. And this is mainly because of water abstraction for agricultural purposes. And this shows that a lot of mistakes have been making also in the past when we think about Nexus approaches, because there was one specific goal, which probably was possible to be achieved, namely to increase agricultural production quite significantly in a semi-arid area. However, that's the price which was paid for achieving this objective, and I think this is a good example showing also intersectorial nature in terms of water and what we have to consider and think about, and that we have to think cross-sectorial when we talk about water management. Now, if intersectoriality and nexus thinking would not be complex enough when we talk about water, there's an additional layer added, and that's the transboundary issue. So I think this slide, this global map shows quite nicely that 2/3 of the global landmass is actually covered by transboundary river basins. So we on one hand need to link and integrate different sectors which are reliant on water, but we also have to think about the transboundary dimension. So that's additional challenge which comes into the picture, in particular when we think about the management of the water resources, because that's becomes a very political exercise also, and needs to be considered as well when we talk about sustainable development in certain countries and regions of the globe. Now, just one quote I would like to bring in here from Paul Ricci, Senior Manager from the Water Resource Institute. On one hand, okay, we have floods and floods, but what is quite often the bigger challenge is how governments respond to a water crisis, maintain the water infrastructure and regulate users can be just as threatening to water security as a drought or a flood. And I really like this statement because it's not only an issue about, you know, how the natural water cycle evolves, how climate change is affecting these issues, but also how you manage your water resources. And in our work, we quite often see that the main shortcomings actually in terms of capacities of management, whether the right policies are in place, they're overlapping institutional responsibilities, it's not clear who is doing what. So it's really a crisis also in terms of the management of the water resources, of the intersectoriality of the topic. So what we really need are strong institutions. What we really need is knowledge also, which can be implemented, and also the financing in place and the information, the right information to make the right decisions. So that's really, I think, one of the key messages I would like to provide. It's really a crisis also in terms of institutional capacities. Talking about this, how do we come to the right decisions? Just a brief overview of the water portfolio of the World Bank globally. We have globally approximately a little bit less than currently. These are the latest figures, 150 projects, investments of approximately 24 billion euros. Sounds a lot. It's not as much as would be needed in order to address the global water crisis. I think that's very obvious also. But the point I would like to make is that many of these projects are traditional projects like increasing access to water supply, ensuring sanitation, irrigation projects, water, flood protection projects, etc. But a very important component is also, as we call it, the advisory services and analytical work. So the World Bank likes to perceive itself as a knowledge bank also, with a lot of studies and advisory services which are created also and undertaken in order to come to the right decisions. And we have currently a little bit more than 80 different advisory and analytical projects ongoing where we try to create knowledge. We work very closely together with research institutions, with universities, also with IIASA, in order to create the required knowledge, to have an informed debate, to come to right decisions also when we talk about the management of water resources, and to have really like an informed debate with decision makers and politicians. We have many different studies ongoing. I think it was mentioned already before, water storage becoming increasingly a topic, with specific activity on water storage also ongoing, where we try to create knowledge. Then water in the economic cycle, also water reuse, for instance, then green infrastructure also in the water sector. So we try to address a number of topics, but maybe just to point out one specific activity, one initiative which was launched back in 2017, so-called World Bank Water Security Diagnostics Initiative, where we tried to address the water sector really in a broad context. So having a look not only at the water cycle itself, but really doing a broad assessment in terms of the water-related outcomes. How important is water for economic development, for the society? Which role does water play in terms of environmental benefits for a country or a region? Then also these assessments include assessments or investigations on the policy framework. How strong are institutions? What are the responsibilities? Are the appropriate legal frameworks in place? Are bilateral or multilateral agreements in place in international river basins in order to ensure also coordination between the different countries? And is the right infrastructure in place? Is the information in place which is needed also in order to take the right decisions? And that's basically the topical areas which are addressed in framework of this analytical work. And we see with this work some experiences is, I mean, these are quite often very detailed reports. Talk about, I think, the Pakistan assessment which we have is around 200 pages. And when we had internal discussions then also with the management and also with decision makers in the country, we got the feedback, okay, can you please boil it down to 10 pages on the key messages? So there's quite often very brilliant information, like in very bulky reports, but we saw that it's really a communication challenge as well. So it's really about picking up the main information points, and the question is how to communicate this also to different stakeholders. I mean, quite often our counterparts are water ministries, of course, for this work, but in particular also ministries of finance in order to create awareness and come to the right decisions. Just as an example, in Angola, for instance, we also did a broad assessment, and there was one figure which really was sticky and which was repeated by all the decision makers all the time, and this was that more than 30% of the children are suffering from stunting, and this is related to malnutrition and also continuous recurrent infections, so it's directly water related also. And this was one point, was just one element, small element from the assessment, which was repeated several times, and this really created awareness and the willingness to do something about it. So we really recognized, okay, we have to work really on targeted communication tools also, depending which persons we are talking to. That's a very important point as well, based on experiences, the work we are doing. Just some examples, you can check it out on the website. We have all these assessments which were done in the past online available for different countries. We have ongoing work with IIASA now for the Europe and Central Asia regions. Currently we are working for water security reports for a number of countries in the Danube region. We're also planning regional assessments for the Danube region and the whole Europe and Central Asia regions. So that's ongoing work. A lot of information, that's a separate initiative, is also made publicly available. So we try to make really all this information available that it can be used also for research and for decision making. What is another important element in order to have the related discussions also with stakeholders, and these are the 3 entry points in the discussions we're having. We need the right information, we need to have strong institutions in order to make decisions on the required investments also. So these are the key entry points which we try to influence with the research work which is done and the discussions with water-related stakeholders. So coming to my last slide, a couple of key messages. Water plays a key role for the Sustainable Development Goals and also for building climate resilience, because climate change is quite often translated or mainly translated through the water cycle also. We need a mainstreamed whole-of-government programmatic approach, which is needed to involve different institutions, sectors, and also public and private. Evidence-based decision-making, I think that's extremely important in times of fake news also. In order to come to the right decisions, have the right discussions. And the entry points for actions, the 3 I's, as we call them: information, institutions, investments, and finally communication is key. It's not helpful to have the most brilliant 200 pages report if it's not reaching the right ears and having the right discussions with the relevant people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. This is something that maybe we can talk about in the panel discussion about targeted communication tools and reducing the complexity enough to be understood by the general public, but still understanding the Nexus complexities. So thank you. Now, thanks to all the panelists for these excellent and very thought-provoking presentations. I would like to invite the speakers to come, sorry, before you walk too far, I would like to invite the speakers to come and join us here at the front, and also Tahir as well. While you're doing that, maybe we can just recap a bit. We've heard a little bit about some of the challenges in the Nexus, and we've talked about the links between the local context and then the larger global development perspectives. And now we're going to move into the panel discussions. So first, we're going to begin the panel with some directed questions to each of the panelists. But if other panelists would like to contribute, we welcome your interventions, of course. And to our audience, we will open up for questions, and after we go through a few of ours, so please keep your questions handy. So Tahir, if you would like to get us started, that would be great. Thanks.
I'm just saying, we have one more panelist, right?
Yeah, Katja should be joining us, I hope. And maybe if we could get the slides, but maybe you can start, Tahir, while we get the technology working. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this was really great presentation, and I think now we should try to challenge our speakers. And I would like to start from the beginning, asking Claudia, so why it is important to employ Nexus thinking, especially under this global change context?
I mean, I thought I tried to make the case already. So obviously we have now 3, joint food, energy crisis, and there are also water crisis. And of course, water is not as explicitly mentioned, but we know that the floods in Pakistan or, fires in, let's say, California, etc. So they all contribute, obviously, as well. to food insecurity, and also limited energy access, and also obviously drinking water insecurity. So just one more word on floods, because I was at Pakistan Water Week a couple of weeks ago, and so people always think, oh, it's a flood, so there's not a water shortage, but actually a flood is a water shortage because they have cholera, they can't drink any of that water, right? It's far too polluted. So it's actually, even so as a fuel energy price crisis, it's also a water crisis, and there is where climate change comes in, but also because of the lack of energy access. It has curtailed pumping for irrigation in Bangladesh, etc. So water is right there, but I think it's not maybe as explicitly analyzed. And if we don't talk about nexus thinking, then we actually don't find solutions. I think that's maybe an important point. And maybe just going back to the, to the original origin of some of the more recent nexus analytical work, where bioenergy, is considered a solution to address the climate crisis, and we really haven't moved on. So we have actually really implemented, decided to go for higher food prices because we are, at least in some countries, expanding bioenergy. And I just yesterday had an exchange with someone who said, okay, if we can do bioenergy, in low-income countries, why don't we just remove the crop residues, and burn those, and we can maybe support mitigation? I said no, because there are studies. If you remove those crop residues, you have lower agricultural productivity. Crop residues are also used to feed animals, and they're also used for cooking. So then we need to look at alternative interventions, and the interventions can be outside. Right? If you want to deal with mitigation or energy, the solution can be in the food area, it can be in the water area. So, for example, to deal with crop residues, so you want to leave them on the field to grow productivity, so you need an alternative cooking solution. Or you need to, if you want to do anything better in agriculture, you need to consider land rights. So basically, the key is to reduce impacts from single sector strategies, and also to come up with new solutions that hopefully jointly improve outcomes for water, energy, food, and ecosystem health. I think those are the main two areas.
Excellent.
Main two reasons, thanks.
Excellent. So Claudia, one more question. In your presentation, you showed results on the impact of limiting groundwater use or limiting groundwater depletion on food prices. I thought that I understand that would happen, but maybe in the long term, a sustainable groundwater use would have benefits. So maybe the message that reducing groundwater use will have an impact of food prices might be a bit shocking, or.
This is just another Nexus study where I run a natural resource management team, so I'm all for eliminating depletion, which is like withdrawing groundwater that's not being replenished. So basically, the message here is, and I've only shown one slide, we then did look at a bunch of alternative interventions, right, that can help to get us back to food prices with groundwater conservation. And so, of course, investment in agriculture, R&D is actually a key way to do that. I mean, you also mentioned that we still have a yield gap that can be overcome, that doesn't necessarily require more water resources or more groundwater resources. We actually can change our diets, and we only advocate to reduce some of the meat consumption in high-income countries, China and Brazil, and not in low- and middle-income countries. And that, again, is one way you can conserve groundwater and avoid some of the food price increases. It's actually difficult to get everything down to the original level, but at least you can make a dent with a bunch of alternative interventions. Yeah, thanks.
So if I can jump in on this as well, this kind of ties to the next question, which will be for Amin. Maybe from a Nexus modeling perspective, you can tell us a little bit more about what the tools we need, like what changes in the tools we need, or the data that we have, or the way in which we look at the problems would help us to maybe come and to some solutions for these challenges.
All right. Actually, through our work, I have found that the integrated assessment models, the global models, are really very useful in terms of looking at the problem at a global scale. However, I mean, without them, you cannot really do much, because these are the foundational tools where you look at what can be done globally, where there is surplus, where there might be shortage. But what I have found that first, there is a lot of ground truth checking needed for these models to be useful at policy relevant scale. So I think a lot of collaboration with national models, national type of analysis, to make sure that these global integrated assessment models that are really integrating water, food, and energy together are producing the results that we really anticipate. A key issue is that we cannot talk about the Nexus without talking about getting the bilateral trade to be working very well. Now, in a lot of the global models, the trade is not really reproduced very well. Now, there is a group of researchers working on data-driven kind of global trade networks and global trade models. I think there is a need for kind of dovetailing these physically based models with these data-driven models to make sure that we are getting the trade rights. Another issue, of course, in order to improve our tools is the fact that a lot of our models are relying heavily on optimization. Okay, so moving resources from surplus to shortage based on minimizing costs and so on. And we are ignoring a lot the human factor. Like a lot of trades happening between countries that have similar cultures. Even if are affecting the economic concept of the law of a single price. So in these global models, we assume the law of a single price. We assume the concept of homogeneous market. That's why we are getting the trade wrong. We are getting the prices wrong in these global models, because we are not really considering the human factors. So there might be a need to hybrid this optimization with simulation, with trying to include the human factor in our global models. And I think this will help us get things right. And then that can move us to look more into also regionalizations. There are clusters of countries and groups are being formed now because people started to feel that some regions can be self-sufficient, so that when you have a pandemic, when you have something that's affecting the whole global network, you are still secured through a sub-region or region that is well connected and less affected by the global trade networks and so on. But we can do this only if we can get these integrated assessment models to be working more properly than they are right now. So I think this is the direction, some of the directions that we need to move into to improve our tools and models.
Great, thank you. Please, Tahir.
Yeah, maybe if there are any questions from the audience or any interaction. I see Michael.
Or if anybody wants to join in with their own thoughts too, please.
Yes, so maybe Michael and then you and then, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So, Michael Kuhn from the Economics Frontiers program at IIASA. Yes, first of all, thanks so much to all presenters for presenting their views and insights about Nexus modeling, as well as to Tahira and Amanda for organizing this, which I think is a hugely inspiring session. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of thoughts. One may be kind of a bit relating to the idea what is kind of important or what is special about the Nexus thinking. So we've heard it's obviously sectoral intersections and linkages. It's also boundary linkages, which brings in additional dimension. And the third one, it wasn't so explicitly mentioned, but I think it was very present in of what all of you were saying. There's an important intertemporal dimension. So, in fact, the Nexus problem, how it's resolved today, will define how the Nexus problem looks in the future, and that may be very different, and it may call for very different solutions, if as centrally planned solutions or a decentral solution. So I'm not asking you to resolve this conundrum, but what I wonder is, and that's maybe my question coming from this observation, and I'd be interested in hearing people's views on how they are experiencing or dealing with the conflict. So one way of Nexus thinking and learning is to identify kind of the sweet spots. Where are there solutions which actually rely on cooperation, but then everyone is better off? So the synergies, in a sense, we've heard of. And that is extremely useful, and we need information in the first place to get there. Now, the information may also actually reveal, well, there's a harsh trade-off. And these trade-offs may not only be kind of a physical nature, but I think where it comes into worst is if it's trade-offs which bear on interests and on the distribution ultimately. And I'm wondering how this is being dealt with at a World Bank policy level, at the OECD, maybe just in terms of the observation of kind of really strong conflict of interest, even amongst institutional actors dealing with the same problem, even within a nation. But also how you are dealing with that actually in very applied transdisciplinary work with this, because having all people at the table is surely great, but what if they start to squabble and suggest actually different solutions which are very much driven by their own interests? Just curious to hear. Thanks so much. And maybe the last point, and then I shut up, is does the intertemporal thinking actually help to resolve some of these conflicts or not? Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Maybe we could start from the practical side.
Oh, that's an easy one, it seems like. Maybe, I mean, just one comment. I mean, I made a brief presentation also on the work on water security, which we are doing, so trying to have a broad look at the water sectors. I mean, this involves on one hand an assessment of the current situation, you know, what are the outcomes for people, society, economy, environment, how is the sector organized, etc. But also what is part of these assessments is a forward-looking component, in particular trying to make estimations on socio-economic development and also how climate change might affect future water availability, what again affects, of course, you know, economic development, environment, etc. So we try to make this information available for the discussion process because it can be extremely helpful. Just one practical example, maybe. We did an assessment for one country not far from Austria in Southeast Europe on the current situation of the water supply sector, and also looked at data how climate change will affect water availability. So this future forecast then, where we could demonstrate that if the country does not invest in beefing up the infrastructure, reducing water losses, you know, developing drought risk management plans, then the country will run into a problem, raised really attention and allowed us really to move forward also in terms of coming to certain policy decisions. And for this, quite often you need a long breath. I mean, we had, for a couple of countries, we have like ideas discussed already for certain you know, policy revisions 6, 7, 8 years ago, and then nothing happens for many, many years. And then there's a political change, and then there's a window of opportunity, and then, you know, you pick it up, and then you try to have this discussion, making this change then also. In terms of transboundary topics, I mean, that's a topic on its own, I would say. What we try to do is with, you know, game theory also, and I think this goes in the direction also what Barbara presented, you know, certain scenarios, trying to sort out what are the benefits, what are the trade-offs for the different countries. But I think there will be always some trade-offs, so it has a whole political dimension, I would say. And what I think we experience is also that countries are rather hesitative engaging into discussions, for instance, on water trading if the water sector is not properly set up, because there's the risk that you might lose in these transboundary discussions also. But we try to facilitate, in particular, also intersectorial cooperation by setting up water platforms. So we do analytical work. Quite often, different sectors do not talk to each other because they are situated in different institutions, agricultural ministry, water ministry, environmental protection agencies, etc. I understand it to some extent. These institutions are weak, they don't have time, they're busy, they're not well paid. Why should I, pick up additional work and so on? So there's a very personal dimension also around this. So what we try to do is pulling these people together and having really this exchange with a kind of convening power also, which we can bring in and putting this information on the table and try to mobilize this intersectorial exchange also. So you need a long breath, and it's very practical work quite often. That's the personal experience I'm having as well. So these are some thoughts on this topic. Thanks.
Maybe we can also hear from Katja.
Sure, thank you so much. I think I'll try and respond to that in the context of biodiversity. And I think one thing that has helped a lot is the development and improvement in spatial data, and spatial data in terms of the ecosystem services, the different types of ecosystem services that are provided by biodiversity, including carbon sequestration, etc. And we're seeing, for example, across countries, the use of spatial data being used in decision-making and being able to overlay different types of ecosystem services. So you see where the highest co-benefits are, and that can help to inform decision-making in terms of where the priorities are, where you can get the most co-benefits out of a particular policy action, whether it's implementing payments for ecosystem services programs, etc. And also then how to get the biggest bang for the buck when you have limited resources, for example. And I think in particular also because biodiversity is so multidimensional, it's a much more complex problem to try and identify sort of and break down the information so as to provide simple communication to policymakers. And in the contrast to climate change, for example, where you have the ton of CO2 equivalent, it's much more difficult to bring all the different types of benefits provided by biodiversity into a single sort of indicator. But that's an area that really deserves a lot more attention and focus in order to integrate them into policy decision-making. I'll stop there for now, but look forward to continuing.
I just heard some comments on why it's so difficult to move forward on a Nexus, and yeah, it's definitely the complexity, and it's ministerial single sector mandates, so political single sector mandates. It's also university disciplinary single sector mandates. So right, we have to kind of start with education, probably in elementary school or before, and then go through the systems. And there are now more Nexus-related capacity building programs. Some universities are also setting up whatever brownie points or whatever, but there remains this tension, between being trained very well in your own sector, like hydrology, water, or being trained cross-disciplinary. So in terms of then actually being hired by faculty, I think it remains very difficult for people who don't come from a specific discipline. So even at IFPRI, if you are not familiar at all with food systems, and you say, oh, I've done something on water, energy, and a little bit on food, not clear, it might be just a little bit more difficult, for that person to find, a home. So I think we really have to change that. And just also going to back, people are too busy. So, and people don't want to incur, additional costs. So I was involved in, Nexus policy guidance for the Niger River Basin Authority. So we have the transboundary aspects, 9 countries. Some of the poorest countries in Africa, they lack huge investment in water security, energy security, and food security. All of it is pretty underinvested. Also ecosystem health. And you know, with GIZ, so we helped them develop a guidance that would have required, you know, all projects in the country that have any type of transboundary impacts. And as we know, everything is connected, so every project more or less automatically has a transboundary impact unless you're in the delta in Nigeria. So we asked them to incorporate either a simple nexus analysis that's just really ranking, or a more complicated one if there's substantial impacts. And we almost were there that they were adopting the guidance, and in the end they changed have to can. And you know, one of the reasons is that GIZ did not provide funding to actually do these analysis. So the countries, really 9 countries, all the ministries would have had to do the analysis themselves. And they were, I think, very concerned, you know, that would make it yet more difficult to attract any investment in improving water, energy, food, and food security and ecosystem health. Because they would have had to think, you know, if I'm putting in a dam, what does it do for ecosystem health? They know, obviously, that there would be some challenges. And so, yeah, they decided to change from have to can. And that is what the policy document says. So it's a step forward. But we are not there, and I guess we'll probably, you know, after a while, try again to support them in that. But it's understandable, so I can't say, you know, I mean, from a science point of view, they made the wrong decision, but from a political thinking point of view, with their single sector mandates across, you know, all these ministries in the 9 basin countries, I can also understand why they did it. Yeah.
Great, and if you wanted just to take some. Yeah. Oh, please. Yes, please go ahead.
Just a quick note on this issue, because I noticed in the COP27 that there were so many initiatives about the Nexus, right? But interestingly, the big players that come with the money, everybody's saying, okay, we are funding the energy component of this Nexus program. We are funding the water component of this. So still, it's going back to, you know, these siloed. But just a positive note about it, I noticed that even with policymakers, the higher you go, when you go up in the ladder, they are naturally Nexus thinkers. You go to them with water problems, but they are thinking, but what about agriculture? What about energy? So as you go up, it's easier to convince them of the Nexus. But as you go down, these are either hydro-minded or energy-minded, or so it gets more difficult down, actually.
Great.
Yeah, maybe we can take more questions. And meanwhile, Anastasia, please feel free to let us know if there are online also comments or questions.
Okay.
Yeah?
She has
Yes.
a question before.
Yeah.
Please, yes, please, you had a question. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Lea Kauppi, still a member of the IIASA Council, but my background is also in water, and particularly I wanted to pick up a couple of words here. Since I have been working for the Transboundary Water Convention for quite some time, and there, of course, the Nexus issue has been on the table, yeah, I was at least 10 years. But there were a few words you mentioned. Transboundary, of course, that's clear that I personally think that it would be even more important to take a transboundary approach, in the sense that, as one of you mentioned, I mean, most of the river basins in the world are transboundary. So if you really want to find solutions, then you have to have a transboundary starting point. But then the other term that was more only mentioned was governance. And of course, when I look from the convention point of view, governance is really maybe the key, particularly when you are dealing with transboundary basins, because what kind of governance structures do you have, if any, to jointly deal with these issues? And so I think this is maybe something I hope IIASA could also tackle a bit more from the scientific point of view, because there's certainly a lot of things to do still. But maybe also connecting to these more practical initiatives. I mean, there are, for example, under this Transparent Water Convention, there's a lot of activities, for example, so-called national policy dialogues that have been running for years already. They started in Central Asia, but now it's more and more also in, for example, in Africa. And then, of course, somebody mentioned this water allocation. So there are already quite some examples, and they have been even collected to, there's a so-called water allocation handbook that was published recently, so just feel free to check if there's any useful material for you as well here at IIASA. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. So we have one question in the back, then Jim, and then Ornette. So Anastasia, we have, how much time we have? 5 only. Okay.
Very quick then.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm Edmar from the New Zealand Institute for Plant and Food Research. So it's a question more related to the food system, but broadening to the Nexus aspect. Initially to Professor Amin, but open to others as well. So just thinking about the food system, imagining that most of the the way that the system is today is emerging a lot from responses to market drivers. And assuming that our models become more fit with better data and so on, and new insights starts to emerge from the experience that you are having, you all, right? What would be the key points of leverage in terms of communicating these new insights in a way that we actually influence how food systems will behave or become in the future? Thinking about from the farmer to the industry to the regional, national level, including, like you mentioned, global trade, right? So do you see some key points of leverage there in terms of communicating these new insights? Thank you.
Yes, but this of course will depend a lot on where you are talking about or where is the case study. For example, I presented the case of Egypt, where the government has a lot of policy instruments, so they can really, in a way, they can dictate the cropping pattern in the country through the subsidy to the fertilizer system, through the incentive they give to water, and also at the end, the Egyptian government buy the crops from the farmers. So they set the price. They set the price for the wheat, for cotton. So basically, when they want more land of cotton, they set the price high. So they encourage farmers to do. So that's a central system where sometimes, even though it may not be desirable, it's much easier to deal with because you have a lot of variables under control. What you would think here in Europe to be uncontrollable variables, they are very much controllable in a case like the one I presented. Then we have less difficulty in terms of coming bottom up and talking to the farmers and so on. But in different areas, like I've worked with that also in Canada, you really need to, the market economics, the one that will drive things. And then you cannot really do anything unless you are able to convince farmers and affect them in different ways. Yeah, you affect the key ones, and then this neighboring effect, everybody starts to, the domino effect, and then things can change. So I think from case to case, things are very different.
Thank you. Jim?
No, actually, I mean, it just answered my question.
Perfect.
As the late Tony Allen said towards the end of his life, it's all to do with farmers. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Ornette? Yes, please. You need the mic.
What? Thank you.
I'm Ornette from the Water Group in IIASA. Many in the water community are frustrated that WASH, and specifically water, is still taken for granted and not enough is being done, specifically in developing countries, and that the impact on other goals, development goals, is also underestimated. What do you think can be done to enhance the importance of water and WASH in the general community?
I think that's for you.
Okay. I've seen there was one slide, I think it was from OECD, on the linkage of biodiversity with different SDGs. And we have a similar one on water. I was thinking whether to use it or not. Finally, I didn't use it, but you can make the same point on water as well. And I would agree, water is really a central element. Now, I tried to point out a little bit in the brief presentation which I gave, the importance of communication. And that was not a joke, really. We have brilliant analytical pieces, 200 pages, and we are then asked, okay, what's the essence, you know? Can you boil it down to 10 pages? And that's really, I think, the important point, how to communicate this knowledge, this information to a specific audience. And I made the point on Angola, where just one figure, one element was picked up. And I think this is at least what we try to do with the work, to distill the key information points, and then not only talking to the water community itself, not only talking to what would be most logical, me working for the Water GP, talking to the water ministry, but going beyond that, because decisions on water, and this was also mentioned, are quite often taken outside of water institutions. If an agricultural ministry decides, okay, we massively increase irrigation, this has a massive impact on the water sector, If the energy sector decides we will massively increase hydropower generation, this has a massive impact also on, transboundary issues, on the whole water use, on other sectors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the key point is really to, communicate with these different sectors, and in particular talking also to decision makers when it comes to financing. I mean, for us, the natural counterpart are the ministries of finance, so we tried to use this information which we have and come up with information which, attracts a specific audience also. For instance, just one example, and then I will stop. When we talk about drought risk management, there are really nice assessments also done with specific indicators, etc. But what, for instance, the Ministry of Finance is really interested in is, okay, what does it cost? That's the key thing, What's the economic cost also? And I think such information, such targeted information needs to be distilled and then also communicated to gain attraction on the importance of, this specific sector beyond the water community itself, because the water community quite often knows the importance about it. It's important to raise awareness also beyond the water experts. This would be some feedback, some experiences we have on this topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Raimond. Amanda, there is comments from the online participant?
Yeah, so we have a question from our hybrid, online participants. The question is about information and studies about different cropping species and cropping systems. So for example, demand for wheat is high in North African countries where wheat is at its maximum cropping latitude. So they say a C4 species like sorghum would be better suited for cropping in these regions, but research on boosting yields is insufficient and demand by consumers is lacking. So what role can policy play in shaping the demand and also in the research aspect, I assume, as well? I think this is a great question for Claudia from the CGIAR.
Many ways. I mean, I know there's some studies out there that would completely change cropping patterns, and then they, can grow water security, for example. So, yes. So what happens is that we have this transition, where countries have moved from millets and sorghums into wheat and rice, consumes a lot more water, is often not as climate resilient. So what can we do about it? So what, for example, India has done is school procurement. So a lot of the school feeding programs now, they use traditional varieties. And so basically you have to start with very small children to get a taste for traditional varieties, and not only the modern staples, but basically lentils and traditional sorghum, etc. So they're bringing that back into the school feeding programs. Not sure, I know in the US it's a disaster and a chaos, it's never working, but they're trying to make those school feeding programs also the food more sustainable and get back to some local varieties. Another one is to improve the processing. So the issue is that in rural areas where you don't have access to energy, you don't have, to clean energy or good energy or anything but fuel wood energy, and also no good water security. And so the problem is some of those traditional varieties are difficult to process or could take 8 hours, or 2 hours or 3 hours out of a woman's day, and the woman doesn't have that time given 500 other activities. So CGR is actually working on changing the processing qualities, making it easier to process traditional varieties. And so if they can be processed more easily, then it's more likely that women will actually be interested in growing them again. So that is another, so that's another way. And then of course, because farmers experience these climate extreme events, and so that alone also brings back some traditional, or grows interest in some traditional varieties like cassava that you can just always leave in the ground. But even their properties have to change on yield, but processing particularly to grow interest in those crops. But yeah, it's a long way. It's not a lot of investment, I have to say, in these particular areas. But those are just 2 examples to how to change things. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Amanda, is there any other question? No, okay. So we would like to basically finalize this session by, first of all, asking Katja a question about biodiversity. We cannot finish without asking about biodiversity. And then a final word from our panelists. So Katja, one question to you. How easy, how difficult to integrate biodiversity into Nexus frameworks, especially that biodiversity is usually not economically valued?
A nice, easy question.
Thanks so much for the question. I think I alluded to that before. I think the key complexity with trying to integrate biodiversity into Nexus issues is the fact that it is so multidimensional, and that it covers forests, wetlands, peatlands, ocean, covers so many areas. And so in order to try and bring that into, for example, modeling, to do scenarios, etc., you cannot do it in a simple way. People try and take elements thereof, proxies, etc., to put it into modeling analysis, to develop projections, etc. At the more sort of practical level, it is critically important, from a government perspective, et cetera, to integrate biodiversity into the economic decision-making. And just like I think Raymond from the World Bank said, it is really important to look across the sectors. I would say, but I think it's nearly even more important for biodiversity because it's so abstract and different elements that you can end up losing it in a sense. And this is why putting a value on an economic value on biodiversity, I think, is critically helpful to show to finance ministers, for example, the value of pollination, how critically important it is to try and understand the costs and benefits, etc. Because of the fact that most of the benefits from biodiversity are effectively invisible in our market transactions. So once we can make that case and put it higher up on the policy agendas and show that there are real costs in continuing degrading our forests at the rates that we're doing, the completely suboptimal rates of degradation across all ecosystems, et cetera, which pose real risks to human well-being, that we can place it up on the policies agendas. And comes back to the point, in some countries, you do see the development of interministerial committees, whether it's on climate and for climate purposes or for green growth or for biodiversity, where they're bringing together multiple stakeholders across many institutes to try and share information, raise awareness, etc. Also, in the context of SDGs, you see these interministerial committees being formed, etc. I mean, I think that's one entry point. There are many. I would say in general that there's still a very long way to go. I would also say, I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence already out there indicating how critical it is to integrate biodiversity more robustly into economic decision-making. And I think there's also, yeah, more work to be done in terms of raising awareness, communication, looking at political economy elements, so that we can really, halt and reverse the trends on biodiversity loss. So we're coming up to COP15 in Montreal, and yeah, I really hope that the next decade on biodiversity is a more positive one.
We can take one last word from our panelists. I'm going to ignore that we have to stop immediately. So I want to give everyone one last word. This has been a really, really exciting panel and discussion. I'm very happy to have had everyone be able to participate, especially virtually participate with us, and all of you here with us. So that'll be my last word to say thank you. And now can I ask everyone if they want to have one final thought, please? We can start with Raymond if you want.
Yes, thanks. Will be a very short one. I think there's no silver bullet. Yeah. I think it's a complex topic. I think we need a long breath. I think there's no way back. World is not getting less complex. So, and just to point out the importance of the cooperation between research and policymakers, decision makers. So if research can help us to understand this complex world, that's great. Challenge for decision makers will be to put it then into practical decisions and to take the right decisions. And I think for this, we need continuous cooperation and continue that path. There's no way back. Thanks.
Well, I can just say that I'm at least partially happy that I can see that the Nexus thinking started to make its way to the language of policymakers and of many people around. I think we need to understand that there's something called the bounded rationality. The public, policymakers, even us as modelers, we don't have access to perfect information. So we cannot go after what we think to be optimal. We need to understand people's limitations and needs. And I think this will make our Nexus analysis and modeling perhaps closer to people's understanding.
Yeah, so I guess my final word is that with climate change, population growth, globalization, all systems are ever more closely connected. And whatever someone does anywhere in the world will have repercussions, even if, unfortunately, we're not quite there analyzing that sufficiently. So my appeal would be capacity building. I think IIASA is doing an excellent job on that, but we need to transfer more of that across society, so to make everyone aware of whatever we're doing has these repercussions. So thank you. Yeah.
And Katja.
Emphasize that diversity really underpins all aspects of human life, and our economies are critically dependent on the ecosystem services that are provided by it. That despite the challenges of trying to integrate it into modeling, scenarios, etc., it really shouldn't be forgotten. And I think we need much more greater emphasis also from the side in terms of the modeling aspects, etc. And of course also then what the implications are for policy. So continued efforts to scale this up on both the science agendas and also then, of course, in the policy agendas.
Okay, yeah, so we came to the end. I would like to thank the speakers, panelists for really coming here, and also for the online participant, the audience for choosing this session. I hope it was helpful and useful. I cannot finish without thanking Amanda for the huge effort in organizing this session, Anastasia for the support today, and the technician from the Austrian Academy of Science. And now, session is finished. Let's go for lunch.
Yeah, thank you very much.